My name is Rebecca Sullivan. I'm in my mid 30s now, and for most of my adult life, I've been described with words like steady, responsible, and low maintenance. I live a quiet life, the kind that doesn't demand attention. I work, I pay my bills, I keep my promises. If you met me casually, you might think I've always been this way, self contained, unremarkable, fine. People often underestimate me because I don't express my pain. I don't raise my voice to prove a point. I don't dramatize what I've lived through. I've learned that calm makes others assume there was never a storm. That assumption has followed me for years, and for a long time, I let it. This story isn't about a villain in the obvious sense. It's about love that slowly turned into authority, about protection that hardened into control, about a father who truly believed every limit he set, every decision he made for me was for my own good, and about a daughter who learned, very slowly, what it costs to confuse obedience with safety. I want to be clear about something from the beginning. This is not a revenge story. There are no dramatic confrontations, no screaming matches, no moment where everyone claps because the truth finally came out. That's not how it happened. And it's not how real power shifts usually happen. What I'm going to share is quieter than that, more uncomfortable, more human. This is a story about how control can look like care when you're young, how it can feel like love when you're dependent, and how, over time, it can hollow you out so gradually that you don't notice the absence of choice until one small moment makes everything undeniable. You'll hear about rules that weren't written down, decisions that were framed as guidance, sacrifices that were praised until they became expected. You'll hear about how I learned to stay silent, not because I was weak, but because silence was the only way to survive without escalating the situation. And eventually, how that same silence became something else entirely. I'm telling this honestly, without exaggeration, because I know how easy it is to dismiss stories like this, especially when there are no bruises to point to, especially when the person in control insists they were only trying to help, especially when the child appears successful on the outside. This isn't about blaming a parent or rewriting the past to make myself look brave. It's about tracing the emotional logic of what happened step by step and showing how quiet dominance works when it's wrapped in concern. If you've ever felt grateful and trapped at the same time, if you've ever wondered whether love should feel this heavy, then maybe, as you listen, you'll recognize something familiar. Have you ever questioned where guidance ends and control begins? To the people around us, I was the good daughter. That phrase followed me everywhere: family gatherings, school meetings, church lunches, even casual conversations with neighbors who barely knew my name. Rebecca is so mature. She never causes trouble. You're lucky. She listens. The words were always delivered with a smile, usually directed at my father, who would nod in quiet satisfaction, as if my compliance were a personal achievement. I learned early that being seen as good meant being small in specific ways. It meant anticipating needs before they were spoken. It meant not asking for things that might inconvenience someone else. It meant understanding that my feelings were acceptable only if they aligned with what was already decided for me. My father was never cruel in the way movies depict cruelty. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He didn't belittle me in public. In fact, he was widely admired, hardworking, principled, deeply involved in my life. He knew my schedules better than I did. He reviewed my choices with the seriousness of a project manager. He framed his involvement as care, his rules as protection, and I believed him. How could I not? When someone tells you calmly and repeatedly that they know better because they've lived longer, you start to doubt your own instincts before they even form. To others, I appeared confident. I did well in school. I followed through on responsibilities. I didn't rebel. Teachers praised my discipline. Relatives called me wise beyond my years. What they didn't see was how much of my personality had been edited down to fit what was acceptable. I wasn't invisible exactly, but I was filtered. My opinions were shared carefully, softened before they left my mouth. My preferences were presented as tentative suggestions, easily withdrawn. When decisions were made about my future, what I should study, where I should live, which opportunities were realistic, they were presented as conversations, but they always ended the same way. My father would listen, nod, and then gently explain why his way made more sense. "You'll thank me later," he'd say. And I thought that was love, because it sounded like concern, because it came with reassurance, because it was never loud enough to fight. Inside the family system, my role was clear. I was reliable. I was the stabilizer, the one who didn't add stress. If something needed handling quietly, I handled it. If emotions ran high, mine stayed controlled. I absorbed tension like a sponge because it kept the peace. What I didn't realize at the time was how early I'd learned to disappear without leaving the room. I became skilled at reading micro shifts in my father's tone, knowing when a question was safe, when it would be seen as resistance. I adjusted accordingly. I told myself this was maturity, adaptability, respect. No one ever asked me what it felt like. They assumed that because I wasn't struggling outwardly, I wasn't struggling at all. That assumption became a kind of social shield around my father. After all, how controlling could he be if his daughter was doing so well? And I played my part in maintaining that image. Not out of loyalty exactly, but out of habit. Out of the quiet fear that if I disrupted the narrative, I would lose the approval that had always been my currency. I didn't think of myself as controlled. I thought of myself as guided, supported, safe. It's only in hindsight that I can see how narrow my world had become, how few decisions were truly mine, how much of my identity was shaped around being acceptable rather than being honest. Back then, if you had asked me who I was to them, I would have answered proudly, the daughter who makes things easier. I didn't yet understand the cost of being easy to manage. The first time something felt wrong, it was so small I almost dismissed it myself. I was in my early 20s, freshly out of school, standing in the kitchen while my father reviewed an opportunity I had been quietly excited about. It wasn't dramatic, no risky career leap, no rebellion. Just a modest position that would have moved me to a different part of the city. A chance to live on my own terms, even if only slightly. I explained it carefully. I had learned to present my hopes the way one presents evidence, calm, reasonable, already prepared for objections. I talked about the benefits, the logistics, and the safety considerations. I even preempted his concerns, which I knew by heart. He listened. That part is important. He always listened. Then he smiled, not unkindly, and said, "That's not a good fit for you." "No, I'm worried." "Have you thought about—" "Just a conclusion. Clean. Final." He went on to explain why. The commute, the neighborhood, the people I'd be working with, the instability. The tone was gentle, almost instructional, like a father teaching a child how to cross the street. And as he spoke, something in me tightened, not sharply, not painfully, but enough to notice. I remember nodding. I remember agreeing. I remember saying, "You're probably right." What I also remember is the silence afterward. The way the conversation ended without space for my feelings. The way my excitement evaporated, replaced by a familiar, practiced calm. No one else noticed anything unusual. If I mentioned it later, it was framed lightly. "My dad thinks it's not the best idea." People nodded. Of course he did. He cared. He was involved. I was lucky. That's what made it a cut instead of a wound. It didn't bleed. It didn't demand attention. It simply marked something. After that, similar moments began to appear. Subtle, spaced out enough to feel incidental. A suggestion about where I should live quietly became a decision. Advice about finances that left me with less autonomy than I realized. Opinions about who was good for me, socially, professionally, and emotionally. Each time it was reasonable. Each time I could explain it away. And each time I told myself I was choosing peace over conflict. But there was a pattern forming, even if I couldn't name it yet. What stayed with me most wasn't what he said. It was how quickly my own voice retreated. How fast I learned to override my initial reactions. I didn't argue. I didn't push back. I adjusted. That adjustment became automatic, like muscle memory. I started to notice that when I felt strongly about something, my first instinct wasn't expression, it was calibration. How will this be received? Is this worth the tension? What's the safest version of this thought? That wasn't something my father explicitly taught me. It emerged naturally, the way children learn the rules of gravity, by falling just enough times to avoid it later. To anyone watching, nothing had changed. I was still composed, still cooperative, still doing well. But internally, a quiet shift had occurred. I had learned that enthusiasm was provisional, that independence needed permission, that my certainty was less trustworthy than his concern. The most unsettling part was how normal it all felt. I didn't feel angry. I felt corrected, redirected, like a draft that had been gently revised by someone more experienced. And because it didn't hurt in any obvious way, I assumed it wasn't harmful. That's how the first small cut works. It doesn't announce itself. It blends into the narrative of care. It teaches you to doubt yourself just enough that you stop noticing when it happens again. I didn't mark that moment as significant at the time. I only remember it now because it was the first time I felt something quietly taken from me and told myself it was gratitude I was feeling instead. Once the first small cut healed without a scar, the others were easier to accept. They didn't arrive as insults or commands. They arrived as patterns, a gentle consistency that made resistance feel unnecessary, even irrational. By then, I had learned how to smooth over the internal discomfort before it ever reached my face. If my father disagreed with the plan, he didn't say I was wrong. He said he was concerned. If I expressed a preference that didn't align with his, he reframed it as something I hadn't thought through yet. And if I persisted, the conversation would slow, his voice calm, measured, patient, until my certainty began to feel embarrassing. Let's be realistic, he would say. I learned to interpret that phrase as a boundary I shouldn't cross. Over time, I noticed that my decisions were treated as drafts, while his were treated as conclusions. I could propose, he could approve. That distinction became invisible because it was never acknowledged out loud. It lived in the rhythm of our interactions. I told myself this was normal, that this was how parents guided their adult children, that independence didn't mean isolation. I rationalized the imbalance because it was easier than confronting it, and because everyone else seemed to see it as healthy, even admirable. What made it harder to question was how much praise I received for my adaptability. You're so understanding. You don't have an ego. You're not like other people your age. Each compliment reinforced the same behavior: staying agreeable, staying flexible, staying quiet when something didn't sit right. Discomfort became something I processed privately, never something that altered the external dynamic. I began to notice moments where my input was acknowledged and then overridden without comment. A plan would be discussed and later implemented differently, without explanation. When I asked, the response was casual. I thought about it more, as if my role had been to prompt reflection, not participate in the outcome. At first, I adjusted my expectations. Then I adjusted my desires. I stopped getting attached to ideas too early. I learned to keep enthusiasm muted because it was easier to let go of something you never fully claimed. This wasn't conscious self-denial. It was a survival adaptation, a way to remain aligned without feeling constantly disappointed. Looking back, what strikes me most is how I defended the dynamic to myself. I told myself my father was just decisive, that I was lucky to have someone so invested, that conflict would only complicate things. I equated harmony with health, not realizing how much of that harmony depended on my silence. And because there was no single moment of overt disrespect, it felt unreasonable to call it that. After all, he wasn't dismissive in tone. He didn't mock me. He didn't ignore me outright. He simply corrected the trajectory, repeatedly, calmly, with confidence. That repetition mattered. Over time, it trained me to preemptively align, to think through his likely response before voicing my own, to present my choices in ways that already accounted for his approval. I wasn't being coerced, I was being conditioned. And the most effective part of that conditioning was how it made me complicit. I started to notice how quickly I minimized my own reactions. If something bothered me, I explained it away before it could fully form. He means well. This is just how he is. It's not worth making a thing out of it. That internal dialogue became so automatic that I barely recognized it as self-erasure. To the outside world, nothing looked wrong. I was functioning. I was capable. I was composed. The absence of visible struggle became evidence that there was no problem. And because I wasn't visibly harmed, I felt I had no right to feel unsettled. That's how normalized disrespect survives. It hides in reasonableness. It wears the mask of experience. It convinces you that wanting more autonomy is immaturity, not instinct. I hadn't yet seen the pattern as something I could step out of. It felt too diffuse, too subtle to name. But something in me had begun to shrink, not dramatically, not all at once, but enough that I started to forget what it felt like to fully trust my own judgment. And still, I stayed quiet. Not because I didn't notice, but because I had learned that noticing didn't change anything. It took me longer than I'd like to admit to understand that I wasn't just being guided, I was being positioned. By the time that realization began to form, the role had already solidified. I was the dependable one, the reasonable one, the person who didn't need much because she never asked for much. That identity wasn't imposed on me in a single moment. It was built gradually, reinforced through expectation and reward. When something needed to be handled without fuss, it came to me. When decisions were complex or emotionally charged, my steadiness was praised, so long as it didn't interfere with the final outcome. I was valued for my reliability, not my agency. Within my family, my father became the authority, and I became the proof that his authority worked. My compliance wasn't framed as obedience, it was framed as wisdom, as maturity, as evidence that I understood how the world really functioned. And because I wanted to be seen as competent, I leaned into that image. I didn't challenge it, I maintained it. What I didn't see at first was how narrow the space became for any version of me that didn't fit the role. If I expressed doubt, it was interpreted as stress. If I expressed frustration, it was reframed as fatigue. Any emotion that hinted at resistance was gently redirected into something more acceptable. You're just overwhelmed. You're overthinking. This will make sense later. Over time, I stopped bringing those emotions forward at all. The role I was assigned didn't require me to disappear completely. It required me to be useful. Useful people are rarely questioned. They're relied upon, appreciated, and quietly constrained. Their value is tied to consistency, not growth. I began to notice that when I complied quickly, things ran smoothly. Conversations stayed light. Approval was implicit. But when I hesitated, when I paused before agreeing, the atmosphere shifted. Not dramatically, just enough to register. A subtle cooling, a reminder of where stability came from. So I learned to anticipate that shift and avoid it. I told myself I was choosing ease. I told myself this was what adulthood looked like, knowing when to push and when to yield. But the truth was simpler and harder to face. I was being rewarded for staying within a version of myself that was easy to manage. What made it even more confusing was that I wasn't miserable. I had a life, friends, a career. I functioned well. That functionality became another argument against questioning the role. If it's not broken, why fix it? If I'm doing fine, what right do I have to complain? But beneath that logic was a quiet erosion, a sense that my life was being optimized for stability rather than authenticity, that my path was being curated to minimize risk, not maximize alignment. I started to feel like a supporting character in my own decisions, present, involved, but never fully in control of the narrative arc. The realization didn't arrive as anger, it arrived as clarity. a growing awareness that the role I played was less about who I was and more about what kept the system balanced. My father didn't need me to be fully autonomous. He needed me to be predictable, and I had become very good at that. Once I saw the role, I couldn't unsee it. I noticed how often my choice aligned perfectly with what had already been decided. How rarely I surprised anyone. How my reliability had become a form of containment. Still, I didn't confront it. Not yet. Because understanding the role is one thing, stepping out of it is another entirely. And at that point, I wasn't ready to risk the stability that had defined my life. But something had shifted. I was no longer unaware. And awareness, once it takes hold, doesn't go back to sleep. The day something shifted didn't look important from the outside. There was no argument, no raised voices, no dramatic declaration. It was an ordinary afternoon, the kind that blends into memory until something small reframes it entirely. I was sitting alone, reviewing a decision I had already agreed to, one that, on paper, made sense. It was practical, safe, approved, and for the first time, I felt a clear, quiet resistance that I didn't immediately override. It wasn't anger, it wasn't fear, it was recognition. I remember staring at the notes in front of me and realizing that I couldn't trace the decision back to myself. I could explain why it was logical. I could list the benefits, but I couldn't locate the part of me that actually wanted it. That absence landed differently than disappointment ever had. Instead of rationalizing it away, I paused. That pause was new. I noticed how quickly my mind began to assemble familiar defenses. It's not a big deal. You can adapt. This is the sensible option. But beneath those thoughts was a steadier voice, not louder, just more grounded, asking a single question. When did practicality replace preference entirely? I didn't answer it right away. I just let it sit. For the first time, I allowed myself to imagine what it would feel like to choose something without pre approval. The image was faint, almost abstract, but it carried a sense of relief that surprised me. Not excitement, relief. As if a tight muscle I hadn't known was tense had briefly relaxed. That moment didn't make me confront anyone. It didn't change my behavior overnight, but it altered the way I observed myself. I started to notice how often my initial impulses were edited before they became actions. How frequently my internal response was followed by an automatic adjustment. That awareness created a small but significant gap between impulse and compliance. In that gap, I felt something like agency for the first time in years. I began to track my reactions, not to judge them, but to understand them. When I felt resistance, I noted it instead of suppressing it. When I felt agreement, I asked myself whether it was genuine or habitual. This wasn't a rebellion, it was an observation. And what I observed was unsettling. Many of my choices had been shaped more by the avoidance of discomfort than by alignment with my values. I had been optimizing for peace, not integrity, for stability, not self trust. The shift wasn't dramatic enough for anyone else to notice. Outwardly, nothing changed. I still followed through. I still appeared agreeable. But internally, I stopped equating silence with virtue. I also stopped assuming that discomfort meant I was wrong. That was perhaps the most significant change. For years, unease had been my cue to adjust, to smooth things over, to comply, to restore equilibrium. Now, I treated it as information, not an alarm to silence, but a signal to examine. I didn't tell my father about this internal shift. There was no reason to. At that point, it wasn't about him. It was about me reclaiming the ability to experience my own reactions without immediately correcting them. I began to understand that the cost of staying aligned with someone else's vision of my life was the gradual loss of my own. And once that understanding settled, it didn't provoke panic. It produced resolve. Quiet resolve. I didn't know yet what I would do with it. I didn't have a plan. I only knew that I could no longer unsee the pattern, that something fundamental had changed in how I related to my own decisions. The day something shifted wasn't the day I acted. It was the day I stopped ignoring myself. After that day, my silence changed texture. Before, it had been reflexive, an automatic response shaped by years of conditioning. I stayed quiet because it felt safer, smoother, expected. But now, silence became deliberate, chosen, observed. I didn't announce this shift to myself with any ceremony. I simply stopped rushing to fill space. When my father spoke, I listened more carefully, not just to his words, but to the assumptions beneath them. I noticed how often he spoke for me without realizing he was doing it, how naturally he framed outcomes as settled long before I had agreed. And I let it happen. That might sound passive, but it wasn't. It was strategic in a way I hadn't known how to be before. I wasn't withdrawing, I was collecting information. When he offered guidance, I didn't immediately respond with affirmation. I paused. Sometimes I said, "I'll think about that." Other times, I said nothing at all, not as a challenge, just as an absence of reinforcement. What surprised me was how quickly that absence was misinterpreted. My father assumed my quiet meant acceptance, just as it always had. Others interpreted it as deference. No one suspected that I was actively evaluating, recording, and recalibrating my internal compass. Silence had always been read as agreement. I let them keep that belief. In private, I began documenting things, not obsessively, not emotionally, just factually. Conversations, decisions, patterns. I wrote down what was said, what was implied, and what was ultimately done. This wasn't about building a case against anyone. It was about grounding myself in reality. For years, I had trusted memory filtered through explanation. Now, I trusted written clarity. The more I observed, the clearer the pattern became. Advice was rarely neutral. Concern was often directional. And my perceived compliance was the lubricant that kept the system running smoothly. I realized something important during this period. Confrontation would have changed nothing. If I had pushed back openly, the dynamic would have shifted into explanation mode. More concern, more reasoning, more framing of my resistance as confusion or stress. The control would simply have adapted. So I didn't resist. Instead, I stopped offering my internal state as a resource. I shared less. I revealed fewer preferences. I stopped volunteering context that could be used to steer outcomes. On the surface, I was still cooperative. Underneath, I was becoming opaque. That opacity unsettled people. Not overtly, but subtly. Conversations felt slightly off balance. My father filled the silence with more detail, more reassurance. He assumed I needed convincing. I let him. This wasn't manipulation. It was boundary formation in its earliest, quietest stage. I was learning what happened when I didn't automatically orient myself around someone else's expectations. And what happened was nothing, no explosion, no crisis. The world didn't collapse because I paused instead of agreeing. That realization was powerful. For the first time, I saw that my compliance had been doing far more work than I realized. It had propped up a dynamic that depended on my predictability. By becoming less predictable internally, while remaining externally calm, I began to loosen its grip. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady. Silence, once a tool of erasure, became a tool of discernment. I used it to create space where there had never been any, to hear my own reactions before translating them into something palatable. Others mistook this for the same old behavior. They assumed I was still the reliable one, still easy, still aligned. That misinterpretation worked in my favor. Because while they were reading my quiet as weakness, I was using it to decide who I would become next. What they never noticed was how much I was learning while everything appeared unchanged. From the outside, my life looked stable, predictable even. I still showed up. I still followed through. I still spoke calmly and deferred when expected. The absence of friction convinced everyone that the system was intact. But beneath that surface, I had begun to study it. I paid attention to timing. When decisions were introduced, how quickly they were framed as necessary, how little room there was for revision once they were spoken aloud. I noticed how often urgency was used to narrow options. This needs to be decided soon. There isn't really another viable path. Pressure didn't arrive as force, it arrived as inevitability. I started to notice who benefited most from that inevitability. I also learned how my father positioned himself as the interpreter of reality. He wasn't just offering advice, he was defining what was sensible, what was safe, what was responsible. Alternatives weren't dismissed outright, they were subtly diminished. Risky, naive, inconvenient. And because I had spent years trusting his framing, I had rarely questioned it. Now I did, quietly, internally. Without signaling that anything had changed, I began researching independently, not to contradict him, but to verify. When a concern was raised, I looked into it myself. When a limitation was presented as fact, I checked its source. When a path was described as unrealistic, I examined the assumptions beneath that claim. What I found wasn't malice, it was perspective. Narrow, confident, unchallenged. My father wasn't lying. He was operating from a worldview where control equaled safety and deviation equaled danger. And because no one had ever seriously contested that worldview, it had calcified. I also began to see how much I had been underestimated because I was calm, because I didn't argue, because I had accepted guidance for so long. It was assumed I wouldn't suddenly develop independent judgment. My silence was read as dependency, not discretion. That miscalculation created space. I learned the systems I had once deferred to: financial structures, legal boundaries, professional pathways. I didn't announce this learning. I didn't seek validation for it. I treated it as groundwork. I began to understand where authority actually lived and where it didn't. For years, I had assumed that control was centralized in my father's confidence, that his certainty gave him power. What I realized instead was that his influence depended heavily on my participation. on my willingness to consult, to explain, to align. Without that, his authority had limits. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me precise. I documented interactions not because I expected conflict, but because I wanted continuity of truth. Gaslighting thrives in ambiguity. Clarity disrupts it quietly. I also noticed something else. The more I withheld emotional transparency, the more my father filled the space with assumptions. He interpreted my neutrality as agreement, my pauses as consideration, my lack of resistance as trust. He never considered that I might be preparing, because preparation didn't fit the role I had always played. That was the hidden leverage no one saw coming. Not money, not secrets, not alliances, just competence combined with restraint. The ability to learn without broadcasting, to plan without threatening, to observe without reacting. I wasn't trying to win. I was trying to exit a dynamic intact. And that required patience. I didn't rush toward independence as an act of rebellion. I moved toward it as an act of alignment. Each step was measured. Each decision is anchored in information rather than impulse. I learned to separate what was truly risky from what had simply been labeled that way. I learned which fears were inherited and which were earned. I learned that safety isn't something someone else can provide indefinitely without cost. Through all of this, nothing outwardly changed. That was the point. They never noticed because they weren't looking for change. They were looking for continuity. And I provided it, just long enough to finish becoming someone who no longer needed permission. The private reveal didn't arrive as a shock. It arrived as confirmation. By the time it happened, I had already sensed it forming, an outline without definition. Something I couldn't name yet, but felt stabilizing itself beneath the surface of my life. When clarity finally came, it didn't bring excitement or triumph. It brought stillness. I remember the exact moment because of how unremarkable it was. I was reviewing documents late one evening, cross-checking information I had gathered over months. Financial records, agreements, timelines, patterns of decision-making that had once felt overwhelming now appeared. Finite, structured, understandable. And suddenly, I saw it. Not a single vulnerability, not a dramatic secret. Just a clear understanding of where the leverage actually lived and how little of it was emotional. For years, I had believed that my father's control came from his authority, his experience, his certainty. What I saw instead was that it came from my accessibility, from how much of my inner life I had made available for interpretation, correction, and redirection. That accessibility had always been framed as closeness, as trust, as family, but it had functioned as a channel, one that allowed him to steer outcomes without resistance. And I had quietly closed that channel. The reveal was realizing that I was no longer dependent in the ways he assumed I was. Not financially, not logistically, not legally. I had prepared without announcing it, built redundancy into my life, learned what resources were actually mine to manage, understood which decisions required consultation and which didn't. There was no moment of celebration because there was no sense of victory. What I felt was neutrality. The dynamic that had once felt immovable now appeared conditional. It depended on my continued participation, my continued transparency, my continued alignment. Without those, it lost coherence. I sat with that understanding for a long time, not because I was afraid, but because I wanted to be sure I wasn't reacting emotionally. I revisited the information, checked it again, considered alternative interpretations. The clarity held. What struck me most was how unnecessary confrontation suddenly seemed. I didn't need to prove anything. I didn't need to expose wrongdoing or demand acknowledgement. The leverage wasn't something to be wielded, it was something to be respected. This wasn't about flipping the power dynamic, it was about stepping out of it. I realized then that the most effective response to quiet dominance isn't louder dominance, it's withdrawal of dependence. Calm, ethical, irreversible. There was grief in that realization, though I didn't name it right away. Grief for the relationship I thought I had, for the version of closeness that required me to stay small, for the years I mistook control for care. But there was also relief, because the confusion was over. I no longer wondered whether I was imagining things. I no longer questioned my right to want something different. The ambiguity that had sustained the dynamic had dissolved into facts. And facts are grounded. I didn't change my behavior immediately after that. I didn't act on the reveal right away. That restraint was intentional. Knowing you can act is different from acting wisely. So I waited. I continued as before, outwardly cooperative, inwardly resolved. I let the knowledge settle into my nervous system. I practiced holding it without broadcasting it, without letting it harden into resentment or urgency. The reveal didn't make me powerful, it made it clear. And clarity, once it's fully integrated, doesn't rush. It waits until the timing aligns with integrity. That's what I did. I waited. Not for permission, not for approval, but for the moment when action would be clean, when it wouldn't need explanation to feel right. Because this wasn't about escaping control, it was about choosing myself without creating new harm in the process. The decision point wasn't dramatic. There was no countdown, no ultimatum, no moment where everything suddenly demanded action. What arrived instead was a quiet convergence of readiness, timing, and clarity. The kind that doesn't shout now, but simply removes all remaining excuses to wait. I remember noticing that I had stopped asking myself if I would act and started asking how. That shift mattered. Up until then, preparation had felt theoretical, something I was building toward, not something I was standing inside. But one evening, as I reviewed my options, I realized that every meaningful dependency had already been addressed. What remained wasn't logistics, it was a choice. And choice is heavier than constraint. I laid out the paths in front of me carefully, without emotion. There were several. I could maintain the status quo, adjusting internally while outwardly staying aligned. It would be comfortable, predictable. No one would be hurt or surprised. I could confront my father directly, explain what I'd realized, set explicit boundaries, and renegotiate the dynamic. Amic. That option looked honest on the surface, but I understood it well enough by then to know what it would become. A debate framed as concern, a negotiation tilted by history, an attempt to preserve influence under the language of love. Or I could choose the irreversible option, the one that didn't require agreement, the one that didn't invite interpretation, the one that would quietly but definitively remove me from the role I had been assigned. That option didn't involve cutting contact or making accusations. It didn't involve punishment or exposure. It involved restructuring my life in a way that no longer routed decisions through someone else's approval. It was the cleanest path and the hardest. because it meant accepting that clarity doesn't always come with validation, that doing the right thing can look from the outside like distance, that someone can genuinely believe they are acting out of love and still be asked, through action, not argument, to stop. I sat with that for days, not because I doubted the choice, but because I respected the weight of it. Once taken, it couldn't be undone without cost. The dynamic wouldn't snap back into place if I changed my mind. Something would be altered permanently, not just externally, but in how I saw myself. I realized that I was no longer afraid of disappointing my father. What I was afraid of was betraying my own clarity. That fear told me everything I needed to know. The decision, when I finally made it, didn't feel rebellious. It felt aligned, calm, almost mundane, like choosing a direction after a long pause at a crossroads. I didn't announce it. I didn't justify it. I simply committed internally to a sequence of actions that would speak for themselves. From that moment on, my behavior wasn't about managing perception. It was about execution. I stopped seeking input where it wasn't required. I finalized plans independently. I prepared for practical consequences without dramatizing them. Each step was measured, ethical, and self contained. There was no rush, only momentum. What surprised me most was how little internal conflict I felt once the decision was made. The anxiety that had once accompanied every deviation from expectation was gone. In its place was a steady sense of rightness, not joy, not relief, just coherence. The decision point wasn't about choosing against my father. It was about choosing myself for the first time. And once that choice was made, everything that followed became procedural. Because the hardest part wasn't leaving the dynamic. It was recognizing that I had already outgrown it. Once the decision was made, I didn't feel the need to explain myself to anyone. That was new. In the past, even my private decisions had come with an internal script. How I would justify them if questioned, how I would soften their impact, how I would make them sound reasonable enough to be accepted. Now, I moved without narration, without rehearsal. I treated the next phase the way I treated everything else, quietly, methodically, without spectacle. I handled the practical steps first: administrative changes, financial adjustments, professional alignments. Nothing sudden, nothing that would trigger an alarm. Each action stood on its own, defensible and ordinary if examined in isolation. That was important. I wasn't trying to disappear. I was trying to become structurally independent. There's a difference. Disappearance invites pursuit. Independence dissolves the need for it. I made decisions in the margins of normal life, during lunch breaks, late evenings, weekends, that looked unremarkable from the outside. I didn't ask for advice. I didn't share updates. I didn't invite opinions. Where I once would have sought reassurance, I now sought confirmation from neutral sources: documents, professionals, data. Facts don't personalize your choices. As I moved forward, I noticed something unexpected: the absence of interference. Because nothing I did violated any explicit rule, no one had grounds to object. My father didn't notice the shift because it didn't announce itself. The system we had operated within relied on my consultation to stay informed. Without it, there was nothing to respond to. I was no longer presenting decisions as questions. That subtle change mattered more than any boundary setting conversation ever could have. There were moments, small ones, where I felt the old impulse to explain, to preempt misunderstanding, to soften the impact before it arrived. Each time I paused, I asked myself whether clarity required disclosure. It didn't. Clarity required follow through. So I kept moving. The calmness of this phase surprised me. I had expected guilt or anxiety or a sense of betrayal. What I felt instead was focus, the kind that comes when energy is no longer divided between intention and approval. I didn't frame my actions as defiance. I framed them as completion. Each step closed a loop that had been left open for years. Each finalized decision reduced the space where someone else's interpretation could insert itself. I wasn't cutting ties, I was closing channels. From the outside, my life looked the same. Same tone, same demeanor, same availability for polite conversation. But the underlying architecture had changed. And architecture matters more than appearances. There was a moment, brief, almost easy to miss, when my father casually referenced a future plan as if it was still shared, as if my trajectory remained open for adjustment. I listened. I nodded. I didn't correct him. Not because I was avoiding conflict, because correction was no longer necessary. The truth would arrive on its own, through structure rather than explanation. Moving in silence wasn't about secrecy. It was about precision, about understanding that the most ethical way to exit a controlling dynamic is to do so without creating chaos, without rewriting history, without demanding acknowledgement that may never come. I didn't need him to understand my reasons. I needed my life to reflect them. And it was starting to. The consequences didn't arrive with confrontation. They arrived as an absence. At first, it was subtle enough to be dismissed. A missed check-in, a decision made without consultation, a plan that proceeded without being routed through familiar channels. These weren't framed as statements. They were simply facts unfolding. I noticed the shift before anyone else did. Conversations began to change shape. My father asked more questions, not sharply, not suspiciously, but with a faint undercurrent of recalibration. He was adjusting to a new lack of information, though he hadn't yet identified it as such. "What are you thinking about doing next?" he asked one evening. It was the kind of question that used to invite explanation, context, permission seeking disguised as openness. This time, I answered simply, "I have it handled." The words were neutral, not defensive, not provocative, and they landed heavier than I expected. He paused, just for a moment. That pause marked the beginning. From there, the system began to feel strain, not enough to break, but enough to register. Plans were mentioned later than usual. Advice arrived after decisions had already been made. My availability for consultation had quietly expired. No one named this a problem, but the atmosphere shifted. A mild confusion set in, the kind that emerges when a familiar structure stops responding the way it always has. I didn't correct that confusion. I watched how it traveled, how it moved from mild curiosity to subtle discomfort, how the absence of my usual transparency created a vacuum where certainty had once lived. What struck me was how quickly my father began to feel the loss of influence without being able to articulate it. He wasn't angry, he was disoriented. Control, when it's exercised quietly, depends on predictability. And I had removed that, not by becoming chaotic, but by becoming self-contained. I noticed attempts to re-establish the old rhythm, suggestions framed as concern, questions that carried assumed authority, casual references to what we usually do. Each time I responded calmly, briefly, without opening the door. I've already decided. That's not necessary anymore. I'm comfortable with the plan. None of these statements was confrontational. They didn't accuse, they didn't explain, they simply described reality. And reality, once stated plainly, is difficult to argue with. The consequences weren't punitive, they were structural. My father was experiencing the impact of a dynamic that no longer had access to my internal process. And because he had never had to operate without that access, the adjustment was uncomfortable. What I felt during this phase surprised me. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt steady, observant, almost removed. I watched the consequences unfold without inserting narrative into them. I didn't interpret his discomfort as guilt or malice. I recognized it for what it was: loss of control that had once felt like connection. There were moments when I sensed him recalculating, testing the edges of the new reality, searching for familiar leverage points. Each time, he found them sealed, not aggressively, just closed. And because nothing I had done was unreasonable or hostile, there was no clear way to challenge it. That was the quiet justice of it. The consequences weren't designed, they were inevitable. When you remove yourself from a role, the system built around that role has to adapt or falter. I didn't gloat. I didn't explain. I simply remained consistent. Consistency, I learned, is the most disarming response to control. By the time the discomfort became visible, the window for reversal had already closed. Not because I had shut it deliberately, but because the conditions that once made reversal possible no longer existed. The dynamic required my participation to function. Without it, there was nothing to negotiate. My father began to sense that something fundamental had changed, not all at once. It came through with small misalignments. Advice that arrived after outcomes were settled. Assumptions that no longer hold. Plans that didn't include him by default. He tried at first to reassert influence the way he always had, through reassurance. You don't have to handle everything alone, he said. I just want to make sure you're not under too much pressure. You know I'm only looking out for you. The words were familiar. Once, they would have drawn me back into explanation, into reassurance, into alignment. This time, they didn't, because I wasn't overwhelmed. I wasn't confused, and I wasn't asking. I responded politely, appreciatively, briefly. I know. I've got it covered. I appreciate the concern. What I didn't add was justification. That omission mattered more than any argument could have. As the weeks passed, his tone shifted, not to anger, but to urgency. The suggestions became more frequent. The check-ins are more pointed. He asked questions he already assumed the answers to, as if testing whether the old pathways were still accessible. They weren't. What made this phase difficult wasn't confrontation, it was restraint. I had to resist the impulse to soften the truth by re-entering the dynamic, to reassure him by explaining myself, to ease his discomfort by making myself legible again. I didn't, because doing so would have reopened a channel I had intentionally closed. At some point, he realized, perhaps unconsciously, that the usual tools no longer worked, that calm reasoning didn't redirect me, that concern didn't reposition him, that proximity didn't grant access. That realization produced something like panic, not loud, not explosive, but evident in the way he repeated himself, in the way he referenced past decisions as if they were precedents, in the way he framed my independence as sudden, confusing, out of character. You've changed, he said once quietly. I didn't deny it. I have, I replied. There was a long silence after that. Not hostile, just heavy. That was the moment I understood it was too late to fix. Not the relationship, but the dynamic. Because fixing it would have required acknowledging what it had been. And that acknowledgement would have challenged his self concept. The idea that his control had ever crossed into harm, even quietly, was something he couldn't engage with. And I no longer needed him to. That was the irreversible part. Once you stop needing someone's recognition to validate your reality, the power structure collapses. There's no leverage left, only memory. I didn't feel satisfied by that. I felt sad that the version of closeness I had hoped for was incompatible with autonomy. Sad that care had been expressed through constraint. Sad that love had required my smallness to remain intact. But sadness didn't mean retreat. It meant acceptance. The dynamic couldn't be repaired because it had been built on asymmetry. Repair would have required equality. And equality was something I had already claimed, not through negotiation, but through action. When my father finally stopped trying to fix things, it wasn't because he understood. It was because there was nothing left to reach for. And that, quietly, was the end of something I had outgrown long before I left it behind. The confrontation, when it finally happened, was nothing like the ones people imagine. There was no raised voice, no list of grievances, no demand for apology or understanding. It took place in a quiet, ordinary setting. 2 chairs, a familiar room, the weight of history sitting between us without being named. My father spoke first, not defensively, not aggressively, just carefully. I feel like I don't know where I stand with you anymore. That sentence carried more honesty than anything he'd said in a long time. It wasn't an accusation. It was an admission of lost footing. I took a moment before responding, not to calculate, but to stay grounded. I had learned that silence, used well, creates space for truth rather than conflict. I know, I said. That's intentional. He looked at me then, really looked, as if searching for the version of me that would soften the statement, that would rush to explain, that would reframe it as a misunderstanding. I didn't. I'm not trying to hurt you, I continued. But I am no longer structuring my life around being understood. The words were calm, even gentle, but they landed with finality. He asked why, not angrily, confused almost, as if the answer might restore the old map. I didn't give him a story. I didn't recount the years. I didn't justify my choices with examples or evidence. I had learned that explanations invite debate, and debate was no longer the point. I need autonomy that doesn't require approval, I said, and I've built that. There was no argument he could make against that without revealing the very thing he wasn't ready to face. The conversation stayed brief, sparse, emotionally restrained on both sides. He spoke about concern, about family, about how things used to be. I acknowledged those things without yielding to them. I understand how this feels, I said, and I'm not asking you to agree with me. That distinction mattered. An agreement would have implied shared authority. Understanding would have reopened negotiation. I offered neither. What I offered was clarity. I'm okay, I told him. And I'm not going back to the old arrangement. There was no dramatic response to that. Just a long pause, a visible recalibration, the slow recognition that the ground had shifted and would not shift back. In that moment, I didn't feel powerful. I felt calm because confrontation without heat isn't about dominance. It's about refusal to engage in the familiar emotional patterns that once sustained an imbalance. I wasn't proving anything. I wasn't reclaiming my voice in a theatrical way. I was simply speaking from a place that no longer needed to be defended. The conversation ended quietly, without resolution, without closure in the traditional sense. And that was enough. Not every confrontation ends with mutual understanding. Some end with mutual recognition of limits. When I left, I didn't feel hollow. I felt intact. I had said what needed to be said. No more, no less. I hadn't diminished myself to preserve comfort. I hadn't escalated to force recognition. I had stood where I was and let that be sufficient. That was the final shift. Not the confrontation itself, but the absence of emotional charge within it. That's how I knew the dynamic was truly over. Who I am now isn't defined by what I escaped. That distinction matters to me because, for a long time, my identity existed in relation to someone else's expectations. Even my growth was measured by how far I'd moved away from control. But distance alone doesn't create selfhood. Alignment does. What changed most wasn't my circumstances. It was my orientation. I no longer scan rooms for approval. I no longer pre-edit my thoughts for acceptability. When I make decisions now, they move from value to action without passing through justification. That doesn't mean I'm impulsive. It means my reasoning belongs to me. I still live a quiet life. That hasn't changed. I'm not louder. I'm not harder. I haven't adopted a persona of defiance or independence as performance. I've simply become consistent with myself. And that consistency is noticeable, to me, more than anyone else. I've learned to distinguish between guidance and intrusion, between care and control, between concern that invites dialogue and concern that assumes authority. Those distinctions are subtle, but they're no longer confusing. I don't resent my father. That surprises people when I say it. They expect anger or bitterness or at least a clean narrative of harm. What I feel instead is understanding, with boundaries. I can see how his need for control was shaped by fear, how his certainty functioned as armor, how his identity as a protector left little room for a daughter who didn't need protecting anymore. Understanding that doesn't mean I surrender my autonomy. It means I don't need him to change for me to remain whole. My life now is built on fewer explanations and stronger structures. I invest in relationships that don't require self-minimization. I choose environments where my competence isn't mistaken for compliance. And when discomfort arises, as it still does, I no longer treat it as a signal to shrink. I treat it as information, something to examine, not eliminate. That shift has been quietly transformative. I'm more patient, more discerning, less reactive. Not because I'm guarded, but because I'm grounded. I know what's mine to carry and what isn't. There are moments when I feel sadness for what could have been, for the version of closeness that might have existed if autonomy hadn't been perceived as a threat. I let that sadness pass through without assigning blame. It doesn't define me. What defines me now is choice, exercised calmly, without apology. The ability to say no without making it a statement. The ability to say yes without surrendering myself in the process. I don't need to dominate to feel powerful. I don't need to be understood to feel valid. I don't need permission to trust my own judgment. That's who I am now. Not a daughter in opposition, not a survivor in recovery, just a person who learned slowly and deliberately how to stand without leaning. There's a lesson in this story that took me years to understand and even longer to accept. Control doesn't always announce itself as cruelty. Sometimes it arrives dressed as concern. Sometimes it speaks softly, uses reason, and insists it knows you better than you know yourself. When that happens slowly enough, you don't feel oppressed. You feel guided, safe, grateful, until one day you realize gratitude has quietly replaced choice. What I learned is this: love that requires your compliance to remain intact is not protection, it's containment. And containment, no matter how gentle, eventually asks you to trade your inner authority for external approval. The hardest part wasn't recognizing the control, it was recognizing how much I had participated in it, not out of weakness, but out of adaptation, out of a deeply human desire to belong, to be good, to keep the peace. That's why I don't tell the story with anger, because most systems of quiet dominance survive not through force, but through cooperation that feels virtuous. They persist because the person being controlled is reasonable, empathetic, and capable of enduring discomfort in silence. Walking away from that doesn't require confrontation, it requires clarity. Clarity about where your responsibility ends. Clarity about what you owe and what you don't. Clarity about the difference between being loved and being managed. What ultimately changed my life wasn't courage. In the dramatic sense, it was consistency. The steady refusal to keep explaining myself. The decision to build a life that didn't need constant justification. The willingness to let someone else be uncomfortable rather than betray my own clarity. That kind of choice doesn't feel heroic in the moment. It feels quiet, lonely sometimes, but it's also deeply stabilizing. Because once you stop organizing your life around being understood, you gain something far more durable: self-trust. If you take anything from this story, let it be this: you don't have to prove harm for your need for autonomy to be valid. You don't need permission to outgrow a role you never consciously chose. And you don't need conflict to claim your life. Only alignment. Some relationships can adapt to that shift, others can't. Both outcomes are survivable. What matters is that you don't lose yourself trying to preserve a version of love that depends on your smallness. I didn't win against anyone. I didn't expose or punish. I simply stepped out of a dynamic that required me to be less than whole. And that was enough. If you've listened this far, I want to leave you with one question. Not to answer for me, but for yourself. Have you ever been told something was for your own good and only later realized it cost you the right to choose? I'd really like to hear your thoughts in the comments.